There's a saxophone note in Money that most people can hum before they can even name the song. It's gritty, it's cocky, it swaggers in right after that cash register loop, and it basically tells you, this song is about to get real. For over 50 years, almost nobody outside hardcore Pink Floyd fans knew who played it. He wasn't in the band. He never got a writing credit on Dark Side of the Moon. He wasn't on the album cover, wasn't in the classic four-man lineup photos, wasn't inducted with them into any Hall of Fame. And yet David Gilmour just called him one of his oldest friends, someone he'd been making music with since he was 17 years old. On May 22, 2026, that man died. His name was Dick Parry. He was 83. And today I want to tell you the real story, who he actually was, how a teenager from a tiny Suffolk village ended up playing the sax solo on one of the best-selling albums of all time, and why David Gilmour's tribute to him hit so many people so hard. Stick around, because the story of Dick Parry says something bigger about how rock history actually gets made, not always by the four names on the poster, but by the people standing just off to the side. Richard Dick Parry was born on December 22, 1942, in a small village called Kentford in Suffolk, England. Nothing about his early life screamed future rock legend. He wasn't from London, wasn't connected, wasn't groomed for stardom. What he did have was Cambridge, with Cambridge first, and in the early to mid-1960s, Cambridge had a tight little music scene where a handful of teenagers were all playing in each other's bands, trading gigs, borrowing equipment, and slowly figuring out who they wanted to become. Parry started out playing saxophone in a Cambridge outfit called the Soul Committee, and in that same scene was another local kid, a guitarist, playing in a band of his own. His name was David Gilmour. They weren't superstars yet, they were just two teenagers in a small English town who liked music more than anything else. That friendship, formed before either of them had any idea what Pink Floyd would become, Nomri D, is the thread that runs through Parry's entire career. Decades later, Gilmour would describe it simply: they'd been playing in bands together, on and off, since Gilmour was 17. Gilmour eventually joined Pink Floyd in the late 1960s, stepping in after Syd Barrett's departure sent the band into crisis. Parry's path was quieter, session work, local gigs, keeping his sound sharp. But he never fully disappeared from Gilmour's orbit. And in the early 1970s, that connection would change music history. By 1972, Pink Floyd was working on what would become The Dark Side of the Moon, 1907, an album that would go on to spend an almost unbelievable stretch of time on the charts and eventually sell tens of millions of copies worldwide. Gilmour brought his old friend Dick Parry in to add saxophone, and what Parry created wasn't just a solo, it became part of the album's identity. Think about Money. That opening loop of cash registers and coins is iconic on its own, but then the sax comes in, and suddenly the track has attitude. It's dirty, it's confident, it feels like walking into a smoky room where something a little illicit is happening. That's Parry. Then there's Us and Them, the complete opposite mood. Where Money is grit, Us and Them is atmosphere. Parry's playing there is slow, spacious, almost mournful, drifting through the mix like fog. It's one of the most quietly devastating passages on the entire record. Two songs, two completely different emotional registers, same saxophonist. That's the range that made him valuable. He wasn't a guy with one trick. He could be seductive and dangerous in one track and heartbreakingly tender in the next. 2 years later, Pink Floyd released Wish You Were Here, and Gilmour called on Parry again, this time for Shine On You Crazy Diamond, the band's sprawling tribute to Syd Barrett. Parry's saxophone work there is often described as haunting, and by some accounts he'd actually strap on two different saxophones on stage during live performances of that song, switching between a baritone and a tenor mid-solo to shift the tone as the piece evolved. That's not something a hired gun does. That's someone who understood the emotional architecture of the song from the inside. Here's the wild part. Parry was never made an official member of Pink Floyd. No royalties as a band member, no seat at the songwriting table, no permanent credit as Pink Floyd. He was technically a session musician and touring player, but if you ask any serious Floyd fan to name the sound of the band's most iconic saxophone moments, they will describe Dick Parry's playing without even knowing his name. What's remarkable about Parry's career is how it wasn't a one-and-done credit. He kept showing up at the most meaningful moments in Pink Floyd's Tour de Falls and Gilmour's Tour Story. He toured with the band from 1973 through 1977, right through their Imperial era. He came back in 1994 for the Division Bell, contributing to Wearing the Inside Out, and toured that album's massive stadium run too. There's actually a great story behind that 1994 reunion. According to Gilmour, he hadn't heard from Parry in years, until, out of nowhere, he got a Christmas card from him. At the time, Parry had apparently given up the saxophone entirely and was living quietly in a village near Cambridge. Gilmour brought him back in, and Parry picked the instrument back up like no time had passed. Then in 2005 came Live 8, the massive global charity concert where Gilmour, Roger Waters, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright reunited for what would turn out to be Pink Floyd's final performance together as the classic lineup. And standing there with them, playing the sax line on Money One More Time, was Dick Parry. He also stuck close to Gilmour's solo career, appearing on his early 2000s tours and albums, and joining him for the On an Island tour in 2006, the last tour that also featured keyboardist Richard Wright before Wright's death in 2008. Beyond Pink Floyd and Gilmour, Parry's saxophone shows up all over classic rock and blues history. He recorded with The Who's John Entwistle, blues guitarist Rory Gallagher, and toured as part of The Who's horn section in the late 1970s. He played on a Bonzo Dog Doodah Band record, on a Bloodstone album, and worked alongside a long list of respected names in British rock and blues session work. This was a musician's musician for someone other musicians wanted in the room. On May 22, 2026, David Gilmour posted the news himself. He shared a series of photos including one from 1963, showing the two of them as teenagers performing together, decades before either of them had any idea where this friendship would lead. In his message, Gilmour said simply that his dear friend Dick Parry had died that morning, and that he'd been playing in bands with him, including Pink Floyd, since he was 17 years old. He described Parry's tone and feel as unmistakable, a signature sound known to millions, running through songs like Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Wish You Were Here, Us and Them, and Money. No cause of death was given. What struck so many fans wasn't just the sadness of losing a legendary musician, it was the tone of the tribute. This wasn't a corporate statement or a record label press release. It was one old friend, now 80 years old himself, talking about a friendship that had lasted well over 60 years. Through fame, through breakups, through reunions, through a Christmas card that brought them back together after years apart. Tributes poured in from across the music world, including fellow musicians who'd crossed paths with Parry over the decades, but the core of the story was always that friendship, two kids from Cambridge who never stopped making music together, on and off, for 6 decades. Here's what I think is the real takeaway from Dick Parry's story. We tend to think of iconic albums as the work of the band on the cover. 4 guys, 1 sound, 1 legacy. But the truth is messier and more interesting than that. The most famous saxophone line in classic rock history, a sound that's been sampled, covered, and instantly recognized by people who've never even heard the word Floyd, came from a guy who was never officially in the band at all. Dick Parry spent his career in that in-between space. Not a member, not a stranger. Essential, but uncredited in the way that matters most publicly. And he seemed completely fine with that. He kept coming back, decade after decade, whenever his old friend called. That's rare. In an industry built on ego and credit and billing, Dick Parry's story is about showing up for a friendship and doing the work because you love it, and ending up, almost by accident, becoming part of the most famous sound in rock history. So the next time Money comes on or Shine On You Crazy Diamond hits that saxophone passage, that's Dick Parry, a kid from a Suffolk village who picked up a saxophone, made a friend in Cambridge, and ended up soundtracking one of the greatest albums ever made. Rest in peace, Dick Parry, 1942 to 2026. If you enjoyed this deep dive into music history, hit subscribe somewhere now. Same, I'm covering the untold stories behind the biggest albums and artists every week. And let me know in the comments, what's your favorite Dick Parry saxophone moment? Money, Us and Them, or Shine On You Crazy Diamond? I'll see you in the next one.